how should leaders then think about building staffing models that can flex with that demand while still looking at, okay, I have long-term workforce goals that I need to fulfill?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a colleague of mine refers to healthcare as a constant change environment. And I think all of us in this industry can appreciate that. I think as we look at building the staffing models, that can be flexible as things continue to change. One of the things we've done, and we're a large system, we're a statewide system, we've actually developed our own internal locum system as a first response. So if we have something that's unplanned for physician needs, then we can, our physicians have the option of helping in other markets, which is extremely helpful as our first avenue to go through. I would then say it's really important, and I'm a data person, I would say invest in your data. I think understanding your data, the volume, the needs, and know really how to leverage your data. And so what I mean by that is forecast your staffing needs. I think most of us know what our turnover rates look like. Do we know what it looks like by physician, by specialty, by market? Are we projecting where we might have turnover, whether that's based on historical run rates? Are we looking at what our risks are in terms of potential upcoming retirements? There's also operations has a lot of market intelligence. Your physician development managers have a lot of market intelligence. They hear things, they know things. Are we taking all of those into consideration as we're forecasting what are our staffing needs going to be in the future, and what are our risks? I think it's important to track your turnover, to not only track it for historical purposes, but also forecast it, because then that'll give you a picture of what are your actual recruiting needs in the future. I also think, and I'm probably not the norm in the industry, but I would say look at your productivity. Of course, we have to have a certain level of productivity to be financially sustainable. I know that. I think, however, that there are also real human limits to what any physician can produce over the long term. And as I said earlier, and Janet has echoed it, we're seeing real generational shifts where physicians are saying, I don't want to be a 75th percentile producer. We're having physicians say, I'm not going to be a 90th percentile producer. And so when you have risks, you have physicians that have been historically producing at the 90th and 95th percentile. Those are no longer, when you start thinking about replacements and retirements, sometimes it's going to take two physicians to replace one that's looking at retirement. I also, again, I'm going to repeat myself, I feel very strongly about this. Any specialty in a market that is one physician, and that should keep you up at night. That is a huge risk. And it may not be a risk for retirement, but at the end of the day, life happens. It happens to all of us. Unpredictable things happen. And so that should be a red flag to you that you have a tremendous risk in a service, in a specialty that you only have one physician. Again, I really believe in the data, prioritizing proactive planning rather than reactive decisions where we have to have a fire drill. But I think taking that global systemness view of where are we, what are the trends today, what does our historical data tell us, and what do I need to be planning for into the future to make sure that we can meet the needs of the patients first, meet the needs of the health system, and that we have continuity of care.
How should leaders build staffing models that can flex with that demand, looking at that forecasting, right, and that data to still support their long-term workforce goals?
Yeah. Well, the flexibility has to be intentional. So start with a stable, permanent core, then layer in your locum strategically, not in a crisis. That's a lot of the issues is we're not planning far ahead enough. We're operating and reacting in a crisis situation. There has to be clear triggers that will define when short-term labor makes sense and then when permanent solutions are needed. And so with that balance, it allows organizations to flex with the demand without losing sight of workforce sustainability.
Yeah. Janet, is that something that you're seeing as well in terms of that proactive, reactive relationship, right? And then again, how are you thinking about this in terms of being able to flex with that demand while also still looking at it from a strategic perspective and the long-term goals of the organization?
Absolutely. Just listening to both Chris and Teague, proper planning is the best tool you can have. For forecasting your needs, building it out for 3 years, you're building out a clinical workforce plan for 3 years. So you can see where your growth is going to be, where your planned growth is. So you can start, your recruiting 2 years in advance for some specialties, right? Minimum of a year, you need to open those requisitions. But, one of the things I always say, you need to plan quickly, get it done, look at all your data and say, okay, yep, here's what we need to do. But you also need to be conservative in your timelines. I always smile when someone says to me, oh, Janet, we need somebody in here. We need them in 2 months. And I'm like laughing, going, and what lifetime, where are you living? And so, be realistic in your goals and what you think you need. And because, we all want to get folks signed and everything, but again, you got to sign the right person. You got to bring that right person in. And even, with locums, even though, yep, we can probably get you somebody committed within the next, week to 2 weeks. However, we got to get them credentialed because you want to credential locums in their entirety. So I look at it, as a whole and say, let's all work together, strategy, finance, medical group, operations, everyone working together to look at the picture and then, okay, let's plan accordingly.
Yeah. If I could, I would just I'd just like to put an exclamation point on something Janet just said, because I've lived this in operations. I really encourage everyone, as you're building your business plans and you're tying recruiting new positions into your business plans and your ROI calculations, be conservative. Because if you don't, it can be a real problem for you later.